Okay, go ahead and start with the review. I'm going to move along pretty briskly here because I did want to do a little bit of lecturing today. This is AMP2, Exam 4. This is review session 4. We're going to start with the lab portion of the exam. Obviously, anatomically, you're going to have to identify some structures. You should be able to tell the right kidney from the left kidney. You should know this is a posterior view. The buttocks is a good clue to that. But notice that the left kidney sits higher than the right kidney. You should know which kidney sits higher, which kidney sits lower. You should know that the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney. Anatomically, you should appreciate the positioning of the kidney. The kidney lies in a retroperitoneal area, lies in fat. Notice the pancreas that sits anterior to it. Notice where the colon sits in relationship to the kidney. I may not ask you the kidney. I may ask you to identify this structure. I may ask you to identify this structure. I may ask you, is the kidney sitting in an anterior or posterior location? You should know anatomically where the kidney is sitting at in relationship to this picture. Okay? You should be able to identify these blood vessels. These are the renal arteries that supply blood to the kidney, branches off the aorta. You should be able to identify some of the anatomical structures of the kidney itself, the medulla of the kidney, the cortex of the kidney. You should know what's meant by the renal pelvis. You should be able to identify that whether I'm pointing to this illustration or whether I'm pointing to the actual tissue picture here as well. I said that right. It's tough to talk today, too. You should know what the renal calyces are, or renal calyx. This is the minor, this is the major, but I think on the exam I asked you to identify this area, so I would accept either answer, either minor or major. Okay, so you should be able to identify these structures. I would also accept renal pyramid here for renal medulla if you use that. You should be able to identify Bowman's capsule, afferent and efferent vessels. Notice the difference between the afferent and efferent vessels in their location. You should know where the juxtaglomerular cells are located at and be able to identify that. I would accept juxtaglomerular apparatus. That's typically the cells in communication with the cells of the distal convoluted tubule and the cells of the juxtaglomerular cells. But you should be able to identify that structure as well. You should know where the distal convoluted tubule is in relationship to these cells. You should know where the proximal convoluted tubule is located at in relationship to the cells. And you should recognize this as being Bowman's capsule. There's a lot of questions off this. You should know where the glomerulus is located at. You should know proximal convoluted tubule. You should know distal convoluted tubule. You should know where the collecting ducts are. And you certainly should know where the loop of Henle is located at. Okay? Glomerulus, proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct, and loop of Henle. This is a pyelogram, an injection of a contrast dye into the kidney. You should know the purpose behind a pyelogram. It's a little black box description of that in the book. All these pictures are out of your book as well. Again, you should be able to identify the renal pelvis. Should be able to identify the minor and the major calyxes. Basically, you should be able to identify any of the structures that I point to here on this picture. The importance of this study, if you have a kidney stone, for example, or any type of obstruction that blocks the ureters, the tubes that lead down from the kidneys, you would have dilatation in these ducts proximal to the point of obstruction. Obstruction here, proximal to that, this would be dilated. And the way you know you have an obstruction, there would be no contrast dye from that point on. And this area would be extremely dilated in comparison to the opposite side. That's just an example. I'm not showing you a picture of that, but That's the importance of doing this test. This looks at the functional anatomy of the kidney and the functional anatomy of the system, the ureters, the bladder, and you can even, if the picture went down further, you could even see the excretion of the contrast dye through the urethra. So this lets you know whether or not the ductal system is communicating and flowing. Male urinary system should be able to identify the prostate gland, should be able to identify the urethra, should be able to identify the position of the bladder, you should be able to identify the position of the ureter. I didn't ask you about the reproductive organs, though it would have been fair to ask you about the seminal vesicles and the communication here between the urethra, but I didn't ask that. Female urinary system should know the position of the bladder versus the uterus, should be able to identify those two organs fairly easily, should be able to identify the opening for the urethra that leads from the urinary bladder. External urethral sphincter is the muscle that's located here. That's fair game to ask that question as well. That's it. Urinary bladder. Again, you should know where the ureters are. You should know the communication here called the center of the trigone or the trigone. I would accept either answer, where the two ureters will enter into the bladder. Urine from the kidneys enters into the bladder here and then leaves out through the urethra. Those three openings make the trigone. So you should be able to recognize this area. You should be able to identify the rugae folds that are inside the urinary bladder. And again, you should be able to identify the external urethral sphincter and the prostate gland. I asked you a few questions about urine. You should know what the normal appearance of urine is. You should know what I mean by the taste test for urine. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. Bad joke. Okay. You should know the characteristics that are evaluated in a urinalysis. Should be able to tell me those. You should know pH is tested in a urinalysis. Should know specific gravity, osmolarity, water content, volume, color, odor. All of these are tested in a urinalysis. Let's ask you. Picture of the nephron again, glomerulus, proximal convoluted. I already showed you this picture. Structures that you should be able to identify. And again, you should be able to tell me on a urine dipstick what the chemical analysis shows. What parameters are we looking at? What parameters are we evaluating? You should know it. You should know 5 or 6 of those easily to be able to list those out. Notice the wide range of the urine pH, 4.5 to 8 for the urine pH, different from the body pH. Normal body pH is 7.35 to 7.45. Very good. Still lab portion. Some overlap between the lab and the lecture, but I mean that's how it should be. Examination of urine. I showed you some microscopic pictures of urine. Some important points that you should be able to recognize: white blood cells in urine, what that's indicative of. What cast, red blood cell cast, the shells of red blood cells, what that is indicative of. White blood cell cast, what that's indicative of. And I believe some crystals. What crystals specifically what crystals in the urine would be indicative of. You should be able to tell me at least that. A 1-2 word answer for that is what I'm looking for. So again, red blood cell cast, white blood cell cast, crystals, what the urinalysis, what the dipstick or urinalysis would be able to tell us about a urinalysis for the lab. Okay? Any questions about the lab portion? I think I posted already how many questions? I did? How many minutes you have to do it?
How many questions? 12? He said 20 lab questions. I think the 20 minutes.
I said 20 lab questions. Whatever I put on the blackboard, that's what it is. I don't remember offhand. When I was doing the exam, I put it up there, so I don't remember how many it was, but whatever I tell you. So make sure you finish on time. How many minutes did I give you? How many? 25 minutes. Okay. More than fair. You'll have more than enough time to write that. Longest part of the exam is writing the name for the urinalysis. So you should practice that a few times at home before you come to the computer to do that, because you got to type it on the computer. You know. Okay. Now for the lecture portion. You should know. Should know the function of the urinary system as it relates to regulation of blood volume, contributes to stabilization of pH, eliminates organic waste products, regulates plasma concentration of electrolytes. These are the normal functions of the urinary system, and there's a couple of others, but you should be familiar with what the normal system functions are. You should be able to recognize when I throw in something that's not a part of that system. Should know where urine is produced at. That's an easy question. You should know the conducting system of the kidneys. In other words, urine produced in the kidneys goes through the ureters, goes from the ureters to the bladder, from the bladder through the urethra, and then excreted outside. You should be able to trace that. You should know the typical components of the urinary system. If I put chordae tendineae, you know that's not a part of the kidney anatomy. So you just should know the basic structures there. Should know the positioning of the kidney, where it's located at in the abdomen. And you should know how the kidneys are positioned there. In other words, there's fascia that's responsible, there's fat pads that surround the kidneys. It's a general description of that in your textbook. You should be familiar with the positioning of the kidneys. You should know the layers of the kidneys. Renal cortex we already talked about in the lab portion. The medulla we already talked about. Where the major and the minor calyxes are. Just a general description of that, and be able to answer a question based off that information. You should know what I mean, what I refer to when I talk about the pyramids of the kidneys. Those are the conical structures that are located inside the kidneys. Should know the descriptive term, the description made of that area. You should know what I mean by the renal pelvis, the renal calyx, and the renal sinus. You need to know the components of the renal corpuscle. Renal corpuscle is made up of the Bowman's capsule. You should be a little bit familiar with the anatomy of the Bowman's capsule. And it's also made up of the glomerulus. So the renal corpuscle, primarily made up of the Bowman's capsule and the glomerulus. You should be familiar with those structures. You should know what's meant by the term macula densa. Macula densa. What part of the kidney is it related to? Is it related to proximal convoluted tubule, collecting duct, loop Henle, distal convoluted tubule? You need to look that up, macula densa. If you haven't already read that, you need to know what that region refers to. You need to know what makes up the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Just showed you that on the lab portion of the exam, but you need to know what the cells are that make up the juxtaglomerular apparatus. Need to know what the renal corpuscle is. Did I already say that? Wow, I asked that question twice. See, that's a giveaway. Questions on here twice. Renal corpuscle. You need to know what the glomerulus is. where it's positioned at and what its function is for. You need to know the location of the proximal convoluted tubule, which again, from the lab portion, you'll have to know where that's located at. The proximal convoluted tubule. There's a distal convoluted tubule and a proximal convoluted tubule. You should know where both of those are located at. You should know where the loop of Henle is located at. You need to know what the primary function, you know I was going to get to function. You need to know what the primary function is for the proximal convoluted tubule. You need to know what the function is for the loop of Henle. Now this is probably one of the more challenging questions on the test. The blood supply for the kidneys. You should be able to follow the blood supply of the kidneys, starting with the renal artery and ending with the peritubular capillaries. So that takes you from the renal artery, takes you to the interlobar artery, takes you to the accurate artery, takes you to the interlobar artery, takes you to the afferent arteriole, takes you through the glomerulus, takes you through the efferent arteriole, and out the peritubular capillary. So you should be able to follow the blood supply into the kidney. The kidney, you should know what percentage of cardiac output has to go through the kidney. You need to know the primary function of the Bowman's capsule. Primary function of Bowman's capsule. I already said you needed to know the characteristics of urine, so you get that from your lab, and it's also in your textbook as well. Also, you would need to know what the normal constituents are in the urine, normal constituents of the urine. Should urine have glucose? Should be glucose in urine? I'm sorry, what? Shouldn't be any urine in glucose. Shouldn't be any glucose in urine. And vice versa. Shouldn't be any glucose in the urine. Should be a large amount of protein in the urine. I don't mean 1 to 2 cells of protein. I mean like large amounts of glucose. No. Large amounts of protein. No. All those would be abnormal in a urinalysis. Okay? You need to know the response of the kidneys to sympathetic stimulation. Sympathetic stimulation. Just so you know you're in the right area when you're looking that up. It increases glomerular filtration rate, so GFR increases, but you need to know the other responses as well to increase sympathetic stimulation. 2 parts of the nervous system, autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic, sympathetic. Sympathetic stimulation to the kidneys, what does it do? You need to know what the term blood hydrostatic pressure. What was that? No? Oh. I lost my train of thought now. See, I'm sorry. I'm done for redundant. You need to know what the blood hydrostatic pressure, what that refers to. It's related to filtration. Hydrostatic pressure. You need to know the function of the loop of Henle as it relates to concentrating of urine. Loop of Henle. Tubular reabsorption involves several processes that we've talked about in A&P1, a little bit in A&P2. Active transport, facilitated diffusion. There are a couple of other mechanisms involved in tubular reabsorption. You need to know what of those processes are. Okay, tubular reabsorption. Again, 2 examples of that are active transport, facilitated diffusion. There are a few others there, but if I tell you all of them, you won't read them. So, you need to know how glucose and amino acids are reabsorbed. It's one of those processes I just talked about in tubular reabsorption. So you need to be familiar with how glucose and amino acids are reabsorbed in the kidneys. You need to know the definition of co-transport and counter-transport. You need to know what substances are secreted in the distal convoluted tubule. What substances are secreted in the distal convoluted tubules?
Are you saying conjugal?
Ooh, if you got to ask me that question,
Because it sounds like.
if you got to ask me that question, that pains me. Distal convoluted tubules. Distal convoluted tubules. You should know the effect of antidiuretic hormone, what it does to the kidneys. You need to know what the effect of aldosterone is in the kidneys. You need to know the type of epithelial tissue that lines the urinary bladder and the ureters. You should remember that from AMP1. Epithelial tissue that lines the urinary bladder and the ureters. You should know what the detrusor muscle does, what its function is. I have to think about how I can ask you that one. I'll come back to that. You need to know what changes occur in the urinary system based upon aging. What happens in the urinary system based upon aging? I've already talked about the functions of the urinary system. See, that question's asked twice. Wow. Anatomically, you need to know the positions of the kidney. It's the second question about that. Different from the first, but a second question about the position of the kidneys. Another question about the positioning of the kidneys. You need to know what the term floating kidney refers to. How many cc's of blood flows through the kidneys in any 1 minute? I don't usually ask you a number question, but I let that one come in. Again, the function of the renal corpuscle. I already told you about that. You need to look specifically at what type of epithelial tissue is located in the loop of Henle. There is more than one type. Type of tissue, epithelial tissue located in the loop of Henle. The types of epithelial tissue that are there. Yeah, all the ones that are there, yes. And it's more than one. And it's less than 100. I'm sorry? The question I asked is, what type of epithelial tissue is located in the loop of Henle? And I said it's more than one type of epithelial tissue located there. And she asked me how many did I have to know, and I said, well, it's more than one, but it's less than 100. So it was a joke. Let's see. Functions of the kidney we already talked about. Should know what the term glomerulonephritis refers to. Glomerulonephritis. You need to know what the cause of glomerulonephritis is. In the kidney tubules, substances are reabsorbed, primarily electrolytes. You need to know what electrolytes are reabsorbed in the kidney tubules. You need to know the effect of angiotensin II, the effects of angiotensin II on the kidneys. You need to know what the condition polycystic kidney disease refers to, a description of that disease. You need to know what diuretics are, just what they do, not necessarily the names of diuretics, but what a diuretic does to the kidneys, its effect. You need to know what the term renal failure relates to. You need to know the description of the renal cortex, description of the medulla, description of the renal capsule. Renal cortex, renal medulla, renal capsule. You need to know descriptions of those. You need to know where the majority of the nephrons in the kidneys are located at. You need to know how the urinary system regulates blood volume. You need to know the effects of erythropoietin, the effects of renin, remember that from the endocrine system. And I already showed you an illustration of a pyelogram in that little black box that describes that test. It tells you what it can identify. So you need to be familiar with that. I already asked, know what the function of the loop of Henle is. You need to know what urea is. Urea is produced in what organ? Digestive system. It's painful. It's very painful. Well, it's excreted in the kidney, so you're partially right. The urea cycle takes place in what organ? Detoxification of ammonia? Liver. Liver. Thank you. I feel better now. Okay. Antidiuretic hormone, the effect of that. And again, what aldosterone does. You should know in response to reduced blood flow in the kidney. The kidneys aren't getting an adequate amount of blood flow. What happens? What does the system do if the kidneys are not getting an adequate amount of blood supply? Certain hormones are released, certain stimulation from the nervous system will occur. Should be familiar with that process. Okay? All right. That ends the review.